everyone. Boirun, bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everyone to the first in a brand new three-part series with our dear friend Rabbi Aaron Haleva on the foundations of Rabbinic Mysticism. For those who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, a national Sephardic organization dedicated to serving the Ladino-speaking Sephardic Greek and Turkish communities in the United States and around the world. We're so excited for you to join us tonight with a new series, and this is all through our brand new initiative that we started about 3 months ago, for those of you who don't know, called the Sephardic Digital Academy. It's a brand new resource to highlight rabbinic scholars, thinkers, new Torah perspectives, Ladino language and culture classes, Sephardic customs and traditions, so much more, even history with a most recent class with Dr. Debanar. And we're so glad to have you tonight with our first in this series. It's really my honor and my privilege to introduce a dear friend of the Sephardic community, Rabbi Aaron Haleva. So Rabbi Haleva, or Chacham Haleva, as many of you know him. Just a moment, sorry. Having a little technical issue. Okay, sorry. Rabbi Aaron S. Haleva was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. His entire family has been members of the Sephardic Bikor Holim congregation since arriving from Tekirdag and Marmara in the early 20th century. He graduated from Columbia in 1982 with a degree in mathematics and from Fordham Law School in 1986. He also attended the University of Washington, where he studied electrical engineering, graduating with a BSEE in 1996 and an MSEE in 1998. He was a long-term personal student of Chacham Professor Jose Faor de Feliz Memoria and received a smicha from him in 1983. He is a patent attorney at Patterson Sheridan, New Jersey's office, and has been teaching classes in Talmud and Rabbinics in the Andalusian tradition, as well as various works on Maimonides in the Sephardic communities of Seattle, New York, New Jersey, since 1993. Chacham, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Oh, thanks very much, Ethan. Hello, everybody. Live from New Jersey. It's Wednesday night. We're going to talk about Rabbinic Mysticism. So let me open my slides, which make it easier. And if you notice, the view on me is, there we go, from a camera that's a little bit below my head. So it's easier if we just look at the slides. And if you have any questions, just jump in. Ethan will tell me how to answer questions.
Right, I'm sorry, I forgot to call this. Thank you for reminding me. So if you do have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box as well. And Chacham, you can just pull off the chat and then you can answer the questions. I'd also advise, instead of people unmuting themselves randomly, to use the blue raise hand function. So that way the Chacham can get to you kind of in a managed way. And if you have any additional questions, if you want, you can also hold them till the end if you'd like. Other than that, you can also just put them in the chat, and I'm sure that Chacham will be able to answer them as we go. Does that work?
Where do I see the chat people?
You just type, if you see on the bottom of the screen where you're sharing, or the top, you click the chat, and you should be able to see the chat.
Let's see, I'm sorry, I don't see it. Maybe this is full screen, so, or more. Oh, chat, I see, okay, very good. Okay, excellent.
Great.
All right, so now there's two kinds of Jewish mysticism. Most of us are used to associate, when we hear the word mysticism, we think about Kabbalah. But I'm going to teach you in this series about rabbinic mysticism. And what do I mean by that? So first of all, what is mysticism? What does it mean? So generally the term mysticism, and refers to a mystic, refers to somebody who sees something outside of the ordinary course of your life. Some people go into a trance in the Eastern traditions. Some people, it's described that the Nibi'im, which is a kind of a super mysticism, would sometimes go into a trance and they couldn't move or they'd fall on the floor. You see some kind of vision that is hopefully not just a product of your own imagination or your own dreams or anything like that. Now, we often hear the terms rationalism versus mysticism. And once again, that kind of mysticism, I think, refers to more Kabbalah or Kabbalistic mysticism. When I say the word Kabbalah, I'm referring to the Kabbalah developed in the 12th and 13th century, primarily in France, and it filtered down through someone named Isaac the Blind, who we call in Catalan Ishaq el Sec, to northern Spain, primarily Rabbeinu Yonah Geronde and his first cousin, the Ramban, Nachmanides. So usually people set up an opposition between rationalism and mysticism. And by that, they mean rationalism is analytical thought, like geometry or mathematics or science, something you could describe and you could take your description and seek to prove whether the description is accurate or inaccurate. So I think in common parlance, rationalism or rationalists tend to be on the opposite from mystics. Hasidic Jews tend to be associated with being mystical, and let's say the modern Orthodox or the Lithuanian tradition tends to be very rational. But in our rabbinic mysticism, there really is no such opposition, and I'll tell you why in a moment. So the rationalism versus mysticism opposition kind of leads to, do you seek philosophy, which is supposed to be logically developed, like Immanuel Kant or something like that, versus Kabbalah, which involves magic and description of angels and a kind of a belief that if your mezuzah is not properly written, some bad things may happen to you. So there tends to be this opposition between philosophical thought, which only knows what it can see and prove, and Kabbalistic or mystical thought, which addresses a supernatural. And I think this echoes the Greek kind of opposition between natural and supernatural. There's laws of the universe and they're kind of set in stone, and that's natural. And when God or an angel or maybe some kind of human who has certain access wants to change the natural, he can suspend it for a while, and that we call supernatural, which in Latin means on top of the natural. In rabbinic mysticism, we don't really have any of those oppositions. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Hacham Jose Faur, who recently passed in Gan Eden Kiste, we would say in Ladino. And he wrote an article called The Splitting of the Logos, where he shows you how in Western thinking, beginning with the Greeks, many oppositions are created, which to the Hebrew mind are really they're unitary. It means rational thought and mysticism are connected. So in rabbinic mysticism, mysticism is post-rational. It builds upon rational thinking. And that's the point of view of Maimonides, of Harambam. When was rabbinic mysticism written? So we know about the Kabbalah, there's the Zohar and the Sefer HaBahir, and something called Shi'or Koma, which means literally the measurement of the height, and it seeks to give you a measurement of how tall God is. All of those, I don't know when they were written exactly, but they emerged to the world in the 1200s, sometimes in the 1300s. But rabbinic mysticism was written during the Tannaitic period, and the names named in it are all Tannaim. That's around 100 AD. Why does rabbinic mysticism exist? Well, when you entered the temple in Jerusalem, when you could enter the temple in Jerusalem, and when people had access to the temple in Jerusalem, they had a spiritual experience. They perceived God's presence, which we call the Shekhinah. How that worked, I don't know. But that's what they say, that's what they describe. And it's kind of encoded in the name for the temple. So you've all heard the word Zionism. The root of Zionism is the Hebrew word Sion. Sion refers to Jerusalem. Like there's a pasuk in Tehillim, Ki Sion Teseh Torah. Out of Sion, out of Zion, comes the Torah. What does that mean? Well, at the temple, the Sanhedrin sat. They actually sat in a chamber that was right on the border of the women's section and the men's section. So it kind of overlooked the lower courtyard of the women's section, and you could enter it from the upper courtyard of the men's section, the Ezrat Yisrael. So the temple in Jerusalem was the nerve center of our rituals. All the korbanot, all the sacrifices were offered there. It was the nerve center of our legislature. That's where the Sanhedrin sat. And the kings were near or associated with the temple. Originally, as you know, Solomon built the first temple. So the three elements of our government, the executive, which was a monarch, the temple, which was the rituals, and the Sanhedrin, which was the judiciary, were all kind of associated with Sion. Now that the temple is destroyed, you no longer have access to that very personal, we would say, mystical experience. Now, but why does Sion have to do with this kind of experience? So all the mitzvot are symbols for something that occurred in the desert period. And by that I mean from the leaving of Egypt until entering the land of Israel, or you might say from the events narrated in Perashat Yitro, which is the Revelation, through the entire 40 years and ending with the closure of the Brit, the closure of the covenant, which began in Sinai in Perashat Nisabim. Every mitzvah that we have is a symbol for something that happened then, or something that we as a nation became aware of at that time. Now, Sion means signpost, like a pointer. Like on a road, you see a sign that points, it says Paris, 300 kilometers. Why is the temple in Jerusalem referred to as a signpost? And you may have heard the modern Hebrew word mesuyan, outstanding, which means it kind of, you see that person who's excellent, he stands out. It's like a signpost. He points to himself, or he points to some attribute that we all know. So a Sion is a signpost. Signpost for what? The temple in Jerusalem was a symbol of the revelation at Sinai. And in a psychological sense, what do we mean by that? When you entered the temple, like it or not, in your unconscious mind, and to some extent in your conscious mind, you were reminded of the trace in you of Sinai. Maimonides and Ibn Azra and the Yitzhak al-Fasi and the Geonim all believed that the experience at Sinai was so terrifying in a sense, so otherworldly, so unbelievably profound, that it not only made a trace on the people who were there, but it made a trace that they passed on to their descendants for as many generations as there are descendants of the people who stood at Sinai. Some people call that a phylogenetic trait. Some people call it intuitive knowledge of God. The Talmud calls it moda'ara ba le'oraita. There was a terrifying piece of information that has to do with the Torah. Whatever you want to call it, people from southern Spain, the Sephardim from original Muslim Spain, all believe that there's a trace in our souls, in our psyches, of the experience at Sinai. Today, people would call that an epigenetic memory, if you've heard of that. So, once the temple was gone, you did not any longer have that access in your soul to the experience of Sinai. And therefore, you didn't have the access to God's presence, however man can perceive God's presence in this earth, in this realm. So what did the Tanaim do? The Tanaim who had lived through the last years of the temple, who did experience that experience, wanted to create a virtual temple experience, and that is Rabbinic Mysticism. And where do we find it? It's found in the second chapter of Hagigah. So that's a Mishnah. There's a Mishnah. The Mishnayot appear in Masechtot, which means, like you could say, tractates. And one of them is Hagigah. Hagigah deals with the offering you had to bring in your 3 times annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So you know there's a pasuk that says, Lo yera'u et panai rekam. When you show up to Jerusalem for our version of the Hajj, which is a Hag, that's where the Muslims borrowed the term, means a round trip. Hag means to go in a circle. So a Hag is a time when you go to Jerusalem and you come back. So you make a kind of a circle between your house, the temple, and back to your house again. So when you showed up thrice annually at the Hag, you had to bring an offering to God. And that's called Hagigah. That's called Korban Hagigah. Some of you may be familiar at the Haggadah of Pesach. We have a little statement that we proclaim after the Hillel sandwich. And we say, Zecher leKorban Pesach ul Korban Hagigah. And then you eat some kind of 2 kinds of meat, one to represent the Pesach, one to represent the Hagigah. That's a reference we have to that. So in the second chapter of Hagigah, there's a famous story of 4 students of Rabbi Akiva, well, 4 students, including Rabbi Akiva, the teacher, and 3 students, who entered an orchard. And it's a mental orchard. There was no orchard. They entered the orchard. It's called Arba'a Nichnesu La Pardes, and they are Ben Azzai, Ben Zoma, Aher, and that's the famous Elisha ben Abuya, but in the Mishnah, nobody calls him by his name. They call him Aher, which means the other, because he kind of left the fold. And that's a whole story for a different day. Rabbi Akiva, Ahad Hesis Vamet, one of them took a peek at what? That's the subject of Rabbinic Mysticism, which we'll get to not tonight, but in one of the 2nd or 3rd classes. But they peeked at something. They saw a vision, or you could say they peeked at some vision. Ahad Hesis V'nifga, one of them peeked and was injured, mentally injured. The Talmud in Masechet Hagigah explains that he became crazy, and at the same time he lost any connection to the Jewish law. So he abandoned the law and became crazy. At the same time, Ehad Hesis V'kises Banetiot, one of them peeked at this mystical vision in the Pardes, in the orchard, and cut at their roots the nitiot, which means the young saplings that were planted in his soul, which is the connection to Jewish tradition. That would be Acher. Ve'ehad ala b'shalom ve'yarad b'shalom. And one ascended in peace and descended in peace. These are all code terms. They have a special meaning, a unique meaning. They don't have the literal meaning that these words normally have. And that was Rabbi Akiva. That's just a taste of what Rabbinic mysticism is. But before we can get to that, oh, by the way, so who explains this? There are very sparse commentaries on the 2nd chapter of Hagigah. I mean, you have Rashi on the Talmud, you have Harambam's, Maimonides, Pirush HaMishnayot, but it's very terse, it's short. It doesn't really develop the themes. So how do you understand, or how do I understand, or did I understand what this is talking about, this rabbinic mysticism? Harambam, Maimonides. One of the main reasons Maimonides wrote the Guide for the Perplexed was to transmit in a coded way, kind of like a maze that the reader has to find his way through. And if you find your way through, you get the answer, to explain the Pardes, the rabbinic mystical orchard, where people enter to experience this kind of mystical vision when there's no longer a temple. So the orchard, the Pardes right here, is the virtual temple experience, and how that works and why these 4 each had the fate that they did when they entered it is one of the main reasons Maimonides wrote the Guide for the Perplexed. But we will get to that later. Now, we want to go to, I said that rabbinic mysticism is post-rational. So what do we mean by post-rational? Maimonides has a theory of imagination, which he develops at length in the Guide for the Perplexed. So as you may have guessed, the source of the next 3, the text we're going to use to develop rabbinic mysticism is Maimonides' Guide, only 1 chapter, part 1, chapter 2. In that, when we'll get to it shortly, he explains to you how imagination works. So in the Maimonidean system, most people begin their lives in imagination. You may remember as a kid, you don't really know how things work. You don't know how a car works. You don't know how a skyscraper comes into existence. You certainly don't know how an airplane works. So we kind of imagine how they work. And we kind of also, when we play, might take like a little stick or a go-kart and we'll pretend it's a race car. It's not a race car. It doesn't even have an engine, but we push it with our feet and we go vroom, vroom, vroom. So you kind of know, but you don't know because you get lost in the fantasy that your world is kind of created by your own imagination. You're interacting with external stimuli and external objects, but you're doing it with your imagination. And Paleolithic man or primitive man or pagan man has a lot of imagination. The world he sees is imaginary very often, or it's got a layer of imagination superimposed on actual objects. In the Maimonidean theory of human development, you first start out in imagination like everybody does it as a child, but then you debunk the imagination and you learn to see things for what they are. And if you don't know, you don't supply the missing pieces with imagination, you say, I don't know. So you go first imagination, then rationality. Then what happens after that, though? We're not just a nation of philosophers who, like those people, those British philosophers who deny that God exists and have debates with rabbis sometimes, and they're very logical and sequential, and one thing follows from the other, and they have a theory, and the theory has implications. We don't stop there, though. What Yeshaya, Isaiah, or Yehezkel, Ezekiel saw was after they experienced rationality and they understood the difference between mistaking a tree for a magical portal to the forest or saying, no, it's just a tree. You can use your imagination once your mind has been cleansed, so to speak, to see beyond what normal humans can see. And that's the type of experience we call mysticism, but it doesn't work unless you first cleanse your mind of imagination. That's Maimonides' theory. And it's going to start in the second chapter of the guide. That's the fundamental chapter on which the entire book is based, and it must be mastered before proceeding in the Guide for the Perplexed. Before we start reading it, I'd like to explain to you what it means, the original title of the book. So we call it Guide for the Perplexed, which is really an English translation by Friedlander of the French translation of Solomon Munk, which was written, I would say, in the 1870s or 1880s. Solomon Munk wrote an excellent translation of the Guide for the Perplexed called Le Guide des Égarés. In French, égaré is kind of like perplexed, like confused. But the original title is in Arabic. The whole book is written in Arabic. And the original title is Dalalet al-Ha'irin. This is a het right here, although I put an H. Dalalet al-Ha'irin, the signpost of those who are Ha'irin. Now, if you know any Arabic popular music, you know they always sing about a hayran. A hayran is someone who's confused. But what does hayran really mean in original classical Arabic? So, you know, the Arab people, including us, used to have caravans across the desert. We lived near the desert. We were not afraid of the desert. We traversed the desert often and frequently. And the Talmud is full of laws about being in a caravan, and what do you do in a caravan, and what do you do if your caravan gets stuck or lost, etc. In the desert, there are really no landmarks, because if you, on your way, let's say from Cairo to the Sudan, to all the way to the source of the Nile, let's say there were caravans, or you're crossing the Sahara Desert to Timbuktu. On the way south, you may notice a hill on your left and a little bit of rocks on your right, and down in the distance, an oasis. And you think you have landmarks. And you think, oh, on the way back, I'll just be reversed. You'll see the hill on the right and the oasis on the left. But the truth of the matter is, in the desert, there is often sandstorms and nothing is static. So if there's a sandstorm that happens while you're far south in Timbuktu, on the way back home, let's say to Algeria, the landmarks you thought you remembered on the way down are no longer there. They could have gotten all mixed up and be completely different, but look kind of similar due to sandstorms. So in the desert, you never really have a good landmark unless someone gives you a fixed landmark. So where do you go? What do you do? So that's called a hayran. A hayran is someone who's lost in a desert and not sure whether the landmark he thinks is pointing north is actually pointing north or is it actually pointing south. Maimonides wrote a signpost for those who are lost. Well, what do you mean by lost? So in the introduction, which we won't read, but it's worth reading, he tells you that there is a type of educated Jew in the Arabic world that Maimonides knew, let's say in the 11th century, the 12th century, who is educated in the Muslim science and mathematics of the day, astronomy, let's say, and poetry, and creative writing even. And he reads the Midrashim, and he reads some of the words in the Torah, and he knows if he takes them literally, he has to reject them. But if he doesn't take them literally, what do they mean? Because he doesn't know. He's caught between two worlds. He wants to be Jewish, but to be Jewish means either you take them literally, which you can't accept, or you reject them not knowing anything about it. Maimonides' book is a signpost for that type of individual. It allows the educated Jew who knows about science and some form of logical proof and words and creative writing, so he has some idea of how words can represent ideas, and he doesn't know what the Midrashim or some of the Pesukim mean. For that person, Maimonides wrote the Guide for the Perplexed. And now let's go to, so as a little introduction to the chapter we're going to read, the guide, part 1, section 2, turns on the interpretation of one and only one Hebrew word. That's the entire chapter is based on that. And it's the word Elohim. And you may not know this, but according to Maimonides and also Ibn Azra, Abraham ibn Ezra, and everybody else pretty much in Muslim Spain at the time, the word Elohim has 4 possible meanings. One is God, one is angels, one is judges or princes. The other is related to the judges, but like a judge is like a legal authority. A prince is a political authority. It can mean any one of those. And you may have heard the pasuk where, so the second chapter is all about the interaction between Adam and Eve and the snake. I'm sure you all remember the story where Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. God says, you can eat from any of the trees, but except there's one tree you can't eat from. It's the tree of knowledge, Es Hadat Tov V'Hara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you eat from that, you die. So the snake approaches Eve and says, oh, God said you can't eat from any of the trees? So that's a what we would say in Brooklyn or New Jersey, a sketch. It's a, he's falso in Ladino. That's a con, because God never said anything about all the trees, but the snake wants to make it, he wants to maximize it. He wants to fake news it, right? So he says, oh, yeah, really? God told you can't eat from any of the trees? And then Eve responds, no, just one of them. And then the snake already planting the seed in Eve's mind that maybe God has ulterior motives that don't align with the best interests of Adam and Eve, then suggests, well, you know why he doesn't want you to eat from that tree? Because on the day you eat from that tree, v'hitem kelohim yode'ai tov v'hara. And here's the pasuk here. So, v'yomer hanahash el ha'isha. Just so you know, this is a Yemenite Taj. This is an image I took from a Yemenite Taj. Taj is a book which has the Hebrew. It has the Targum, the Aramaic translation, in this case of Ankelos. You heard of him as Onkelos, but in Sephardic Hebrew, we call him Ankelos. He was a Greek-speaking individual, Roman. And this side is where you practice to read the Sefer, so there's no vowels at all. So you just cover up this side here, and then you could read this one. That's called a Taj. That's how that's their Chumash. So now, Vayomer HaNahash El HaIsha Lo Mot Tumutun. The Nahash the snake told the woman, you won't die if you eat from that Es Hadat. You know why God won't let you? Ki Yodea Elohim, Ki B'yom Acholchem Mimenu, V'nifkecho Arnechem, V'hitem Kelohim Yode'ai Tov V'hara. This is the key phrase, but I'll translate the whole thing. Because God knows. Elohim here means God. Ki B'yom Acholchem Mimenu, on the day that you eat from that tree of knowledge, V'nifkecho Arnechem, your eyes will open. V'hitem Kelohim, and you will be like blank. What does Elohim mean here? Yode'ai Tov V'hara, those who know good and evil. So now, there's some clues here. Ki Yodea Elohim. Elohim is a plural word in Hebrew. The singular is Eloah. But we always use the word Elohim in the plural to refer to, in some instances, God. Remember, it could be 4 things, but in this instance, this one here is God. And you use the singular verb, Yodea. That makes good sense. But here, V'hitem kelohim, you'll be like Elohim, Yoda'e, in the plural, the knowers of good and evil. So does Yoda'e refer to Elohim in a plural? Does it refer to Adam and Eve? So let's look at the Targum. Are gele kolam Adonai, because it is clear in front of God, are that, biyomad techlun minneh, on the day that you eat from it, ki biyom achochem mimenu, he's translating that almost literally, yitpatehan arnechon, your eyes will open. That's the Hebrew shoresh we know, patah. Why he uses pakah instead of patach, Maimonides will address in due course. And now what happens when you eat it? Your eyes open, and now what happens? You have open eyes, and that means vihitem kelohim utehon kerabravim. And you will be like gods? Nope. Princes. You will be like princes, political leaders. Hochmin ben tab levish, who have the perspicacity, who have the intelligence to distinguish between tab and bish. What does tab and bish mean? Now we're ready to see what Harambam says. So let's see now. I think I have to new share and this. Here we go. Good. Is that showing? It should, I hope. Okay. Can someone tell me if they, can everybody see the Moreh Nebuchim?
No, you have to share that as well.
Oh, I have to do that too. Okay, here we go. Let's see. So, okay, new share. And then, no, and then this. Is it shared now?
All good.
Okay, good. Okay, so here, let me tell you why I chose this version. So here you see Moreh Nebuchim. This is a translation into Hebrew on the right. And here in the left is the original Arabic language, the original version of the book. Now Harambam wrote it in Hebrew letters, but in the Arabic language. And that's how we all wrote Ladino, of course, if you've seen it. And this is how we wrote Judeo-Arabic. We did not use, although they were able to read and write regular Arabic, they did not use it. They used Hebrew letters. I'm not sure why. I think they did not want non-Hebrew people to penetrate everything they were saying. So when they wanted to say something important, but for a Jewish audience, they would write Arabic in Hebrew letters, and every Jew could read that, but not every non-Jew. So now, here's the setup of the question. Iksha li adam milumad. I was asked a question by a learned individual. And in the Arabic, I'll just refer to the Arabic when it's very helpful. Rijal alumi means a learned individual. Lifnei shanim, many years ago, kushya mufla'a, a wondrous question. Ra'ui lihitbonen bekushya uchubatenu betiru saha. And it's fitting, it's worth it to understand well in the question that this learned individual asked me, uchubatenu, and in our answer, in explanation of it. Now Harambam recognized, at the time he wrote this book, the Dalalet el-Ha'irim, the Moreh Nebuchim, he was 65, I believe. And he finished it, I think, at 65. I think he started at 60. And he died at 70. So this was the last thing he produced. And he knew he was a Jewish leader of the first class. So he uses the royal we. That's why he says, Uchubatenu, and in the Arabic, Wujuabna, and our answer, Betirusa, in its explanation. That's why he uses the third person plural. But before I repeat the question and its answer, Omar, I will say, Kebar yada kol ibri. Every Israelite knows, and he's using the word Hebrew because he's going to refer to knowledge of the Hebrew language. Kishem Elohim, that the noun Elohim, Mishutaf, is a polysemic noun. So many words in Hebrew have multiple meanings, have a common meaning that everybody's used to, but then it has a more metaphoric meaning. And most of the midrashim and the allegorical parts of the Torah use words which have both a literal meaning and a metaphoric meaning, and they expect you to know when to use the metaphoric meaning and when not. So it's the job of a teacher of Chumash to hand you over when a word Elohim means one of its four meanings. So let me read it again. Omar, I will say, Kebar yada kol ibri, every Israelite, every Hebrew knows, Kishem Elohim, that the noun Elohim, mishutaf, is borrowed. Means it could be borrowed for four different meanings. So in Maimonides' mental vocabulary, there's a word which is called sharah in Arabic, means the dictionary definition of a word. And then the semantic of a word is called ma'na or ma'ani, the meanings. So it could have four meanings: Adonai, God; malachim, angels; dayanim, judges; and manhigei hamedinot, and political leaders, those who lead states. Uchbar be'er ankelos hager alav hashalom. And Ankelos, the convert who created the Targum we were just reading before, already explained the nachon hu mashe be'er, and it's correct. Nachon in Hebrew means true, correct. The Arabic is more precise. Well, sahih. Sahih is really true, like absolutely true. The nachon hu mashe be'er, and it's true what he said. Ki omro, that his statement, referring to God, his statement refers to God always. That means he's quoting a pasuk. V'yitem kelohim yode'ayet b'vara. When God narrated in the Chumash, in Parashat Bereshit, the story of the snake and what his pitch was to Eve, hakavana bo ha'inyan, the intent there is the meaning. There's that Arabic word il-ma'ani, which is the same root as the Hebrew inyan. The intent by using that word, ha'inyan ha'aharon, the latter meaning, which is manhigei hamedinot, political leaders. Amar, so Ankelos said, like we just studied, uthon kerab rebin, and you'll be like princes. So if you know, in Hebrew and in Arabic, the word for master is rab. So when they created the term rabbi, they were actually meant like a master and a servant in the sense of an apprentice. So you learned a trade as an apprentice from a master. He didn't pay you, but in return for your work, he educated you in how to practice the trade. That's how you learn to be a blacksmith. That's how you learn to be a doctor. That's how in America you learn to be a lawyer through the days of Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln never attended law school. Nobody did in the 1800s. He apprenticed with an existing lawyer, and that was called reading at the law. And you read at the law in some lawyer's office for 2 or 3 years until you knew enough to practice law. That's how it worked. So an apprentice is a servant of a rab. And you may have heard the Arabic term, oh, like we say in Ladino, ya señor del mundo, like an old man will complain, oh, ya señor del mundo, like enough of that already. Oh, master of the universe. Arabic speaking Jews say, ya rib. Oh, ya rib means the master. And for Harambam, the first mitzvah in the Torah is to accept the sovereignty of God. In the Sefer HaMitzvot, he calls that al-mitzvah al-awali, the first mitzvah, who is al-rububiyya, the acceptance of the sovereignty. So the root resh bet, which often is doubled in resh bet, means a lord, a political lord, a master. And it could be a king, it could be a warlord, it could be a wazir, any of those. So the Targum says, Utehon kerab revin, you will be like princes. Ve'ahar hasa'at shetuv shem zeh, nazkirat kushya. Now, after this little introduction, where I present to you the 4 possible meanings of Elohim, and I'm telling you, says Maimonides, that the latter one is intended, we will now, again, the royal we will restate the question. Amar HaMakshe. By the way, before we do that, let me ask everybody a question, but you don't have to answer. So according to Ibn Azra and now Maimonides, Ibn Azra, yes, also, He says Shoftim, and Ankelos, the Ger in Targum Ankelos, and now Maimonides endorses it. The snake is telling Adam and Eve, or Eve primarily, if you eat from the tree of Es Hadat Tov V'Hara, you will be like princes. All right, here's my question. How many people are in the world? Adam and Eve. At this point in the Garden of Eden, they don't have any children yet. That all happened after they were expelled. So what do you mean princes? How would Eve know what a prince is? The snake says, you will be like princes if you eat this thing, and that's why God doesn't want you to eat it. That's why he threatened you with death, but really, he doesn't want you to open your eyes because you'll be like princes. And princes are the ones who know between good and evil. What princes? As we say in Spanish, ande parande princes. Where in her entire life, which is not that long, has Eve ever experienced a prince? That's my question. Now, Amar HaMaksheh, the questioner, who this Rijal Alumi, this Adam Milumad, who asked Maimonides a question sometime before he wrote this book, it seems from the plain meaning of the scripture, ki hakavana harishona ba'adam shehiye kishar ba'ale hayim lelo sechel lo tebuna velo yabdil ben tov lara. It seems from the plain meaning of the narrative that the original intent of God regarding Adam was that he should be like all the other animals, without intelligence, without the ability to understand. He wouldn't be able to distinguish between good and evil. But when Adam and Eve rebelled and they broke the first mitzvah that they were ever given, which is don't eat from this tree, and they ate it anyway, that rebellion brought to man the completion, the powerful completion, means the profound completion, means development, profound development of the human soul, which is unique to mankind. Vihi, and that is sheyehe lo koach hahabhana hamasui banu, that he should have the power or the mental capacity to distinguish, which is extant among us, shehu nichbad mikol ha'inyanim ha'misuyim banu ubo mahotenu, which is our most honorable attribute, and that is, matter of fact, that is what our essence is, the ability to distinguish things like between what is good and know what is evil. Like, you know, in the myth Pinocchio, a real boy can tell the difference between good and bad, right? He doesn't just follow the donkeys in wherever that place is, that where they give you all the candy, but he knows the difference between good and bad, and he can choose. So the questioner is asking, it's only after eating from the Es Hadad that man acquired the ability to distinguish between Tov and Ra, and that is the most honorable attribute we as people have. How can it be that that's the result of rebellion against God's mitzvah? Why is it that you do something wrong, you violate God's command, and you improve yourself? And this is therefore a wonder. It's like a perplexing thing. I have no idea how to solve it. That the punishment for his rebellion should be latet lo shelemut shelo hayta lo v'hu hasechel, is to give him the completion or the full development of his potential that he didn't have before, and that is intelligence. And basechel, you see in the Arabic, wehu al-aqal. Aqal is cognition, it's intelligence, right? Ve'en ze ela kedibre ha'omer she'echad mibnei adam himra v'hirba lifshoa ve'az nilkach v'ne'aseh kochab b'shamayim. This is no different than he who says that there was a man who rebelled and he continued, he was perpetually poshea, means negligent, just didn't care, intentional negligence. And as a result of that, he was taken and he became a star in the heavens. Now, this is a reference to Greek mythology where the noble humans after they die are made into parts of constellations. So that Harambam's giving you a little code here. The analogy that this educated man, educated Jew obviously, makes to his reading of the snake and the Es Hadad story as the analogy to express the incongruity of it, he uses one from Greek mythology. That's a code word that his mind is somehow not fully in the Hebrew side of the fence. But that's how Harambam subtly tells you that. This is the intent, or this was the intent of the question, and its meaning. And if I'm paraphrasing, if I'm just kind of articulating my own mental recollection of it, that may be, and he may not have used those exact words, but the meaning I've transmitted to you is exactly what this individual asked me. So I want you to bend your ear to understand the meaning behind our answer. So far so good. Everybody with me? Anybody has any question before we go on? This is the question, the setup of this chapter, and Harambam has just related this question from an allegedly learned individual who somehow has his mind in Greek mythology, or to some extent. So if there's no other questions at the moment, I'm looking at the chat, nothing, okay, good. Let's go to the answer then. Oops, okay. Amarnu, we said, and this is our answer. Now this is going to be a harsh answer, so this is part of the code. Remember I told you that the Guide for the Perplexed, it's not like Plato's Republic, and it's not like Immanuel Kant's philosophy books. It's not even like a structuralist book like I don't know, Foucault or even Jean Piaget, who speaks but may even speak in an orderly fashion, even if he's using some a little cryptic way of writing. Harambam is creating a maze out of words. And to solve the maze, you have to compare all the different elements of each chapter, one to the other, and see how they together spell out a message. The narrative is not the whole message. What's the message is what's behind the narrative. Or I'm fond of a Buddhist saying, Buddhist masters say the following: you always measure the visible by the invisible. Or another way of saying it, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who wasn't Jewish, but his father was, said, there's two books. For every book that I write, there's two parts. There's the written part and the unwritten part. And the unwritten part is the most important of the both of them. Same thing here. Harambam is giving little clues. He calls him Adam Milumad, not Hacham, but learned. Means he's read things, he went to school, he graduated. He asks a question. The question makes certain assumptions about the word Elohim. And so we preface our discussion with going through the various possible meanings of Elohim. And then in the question, he makes an analogy, and the analogy happens to fall squarely within Greek mythology, probably something no Hebrew would actually do. And that's why it's important when Harambam says, Kevar yada kol ibri. If you have the Hebraic values, you have some connection to the distant past of Bnei Israel, who are Ibrim, you will understand my answer. So now, here's my answer. Amarnu, we said, Ata ha'me'ayen b'tchilat mahashabto v'ra'ayono. You who are investigating, le'ayen means to investigate, at the beginning of his thoughts and his ideas. It means at the first blush. What we say in English, first blush. It means you're reading this pasuk in the first blush, and you already kind of said it because you're saying Peshat Hakatub. Well, maybe this first part of Bereshit has no Peshat. Maybe everything is a metaphor and an allegory, and you have to know how to decode it. That's what he's saying here. Umi shelama sheyabin sefer shehu hachsharat harishonim ve'aharonim. And you, being somebody, umi and who we would say, and who is somebody, shedama, who imagined, sheyabin sefer shu hachsharat harishonim ve'aharonim, that he could understand a book, which means the Chumash, shehu, which is hachsharat harishonim ve'aharonim, the developmental practice, the developmental text. It prepares you, like lehachshir, like makes you kasher, but that means in Hebrew to prepare you. This book is a developmental book. It's not just a book you read in one setting and you put it down and, oh, I know the Chumash. You read it over and over and over, and every time you do, you see new connections that you didn't see before. And as you grow, your understanding of the book grows, and it opens up new vistas, and then you have more questions, and it's an ongoing process. That's what we mean by Haksharat Harishonim Ve'aharonim. It's a developmental text for the earlier generations and the later generations, and also it's a developmental text for men in their youth and also men in their old age. It's both in time and within an individual's lifespan. Be'obro alav, when you think you can understand this book, when you pass over it, b'miksat ha'aitim ha'pinuyim min ha'mishteh ve'hatashmish, when you just glance at it, be'obro, like obro in English would be when you pass over it, because it's be'obro alav b'miksat, like you kind of glance at it in the free time you have, ha'aitim ha'pinuyim min ha'mishteh ve'hatashmish, between drinking and having sex. Just like someone kind of skips through or glances through one of those books, history books, like a newspaper or recent, like they didn't have newspapers, but they had like books of recent events, or a book of poetry. So we would say, you think you can understand the Torah, which was the developmental text for generations, first and last, and you think you can process that book like someone reading a magazine in the dentist's office. That would be the way to translate it into modern English. What he's trying to say here is, you think you can just review that when you have a few free moments sitting in the dentist's office. Okay, very good. And Moria Sulin has an excellent comment in the chat, but I'm not going to repeat it because we're almost wrapping up for this session. So, ten da'atcha, you should put your understanding. The only way to explain this, I hope you know some Judeo-Spanish, is meteti entino. Anybody ever heard the phrase meter entino? It means to put in your mind, but that's what it literally means. But it doesn't mean put in your mind. It means like pay attention, like know this, like listen to me, or like, are you listening, soldier? Meter entino, that's the exact same lashon that Hanabam is using here. Ten da'atcha, put or give your understanding. V'hitbonen, and understand. Ki en hadavar kefi shehashabta be'ayun rishon, that the matter is not at all like you thought at the first glance. Ella, rather, kefi sheyitbarer le'achar hitbonenut b'devarim halalu. The only way to understand it is what would become clear, sheyitbarer milashon barur, le'achar, after hitbonenut b'devarim halalu, after a kind of an active understanding, an active engagement with all of these issues, like human mind, early man, what was the mind of Adam and Eve, what did the first commandment mean about not eating from this tree, what happened to them that they chose to eat from it, and what happened to them as a result of eating from it. What do all those things mean? Vehu shehasech, and that is, shehasechel asher hishpia Adonai la'adam, shehu shelemuto hasofit, hu asher nitan la'adam lifnei merio. So the way you pose the question, you're trying to say that man, after eating from the Es Hadad, achieved his final development. You're wrong. The sechel, the intelligence that God emanated to man, which is his ultimate perfection, Hu asher nitan la'adam lifnei merio. That's what Adam had before he rebelled. The alav ne'emar, and we'll finish with this, bo shehu b'selem Elohim u'bidmuto. And on that man, on that full, complete, created adult man, the pasuk says he was created b'selem Elohim u'bidmuto. Selem Elohim literally means in the image of God, and demut is like his form. But the first chapter of the Moreh Nebuchim, which we're not going to read because it's a little belabored, explains to you exactly what Selem Elohim and demuto means. I'll just tell you what Harambam's conclusion. Selem Elohim means the internal DNA or mental DNA that makes a thing what it is. Like the DNA of a frog makes it a frog. The mental DNA of a human is similar in some way to God, and that's the following. Just like God can freely create and define his own realm, within limits, we have choices and we can program our own minds, like a computer program that can reprogram itself. That's what Selem Elohim means. We have free choice, and we can go ahead and use that free choice to program our mind. That was a perfection that no animal had. The creation of man was a quantum leap over whatever came before. And that Adam had before he violated the mitzvah. And now I'm hearing my alarm. So now you have the question, now you have the answer, and we will pick up this next week. But now you know the question, and now you know the beginning of the answer is that the educated individual is wrong. The ultimate perfection was before eating from the Es Hadat. So then what happened after the Es Hadat? Stay tuned for next week.
Chazak Rabbi, thank you so much. Just to make sure, if there are any other questions, feel free to enter in the chat. Maybe take 1 more minute to answer any questions, Hacham, if that's okay with you.
Sure, absolutely. You bet.
It looks like we had one question from Ephraim Ayla. What is the difference between Kushia and She'ala that Mori Gafia would use the former? If you see the chat, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of the words. I apologize.
No, that's fine. Why does he use the word kushia? That's a good question. So I think Mori Asulin answered that one. So the question is not like a innocent she'ela, which masala would be the Hebrew word for that, the Arabic word. Am I correct, Mori? I'm trying to find the chat and I don't see it. More, here we go. What do you think, Maury? If you're listening, just type in an answer if you can. But I think the Arabic word here is more precisely a contradiction, says Rahmiel Travitz, who's an Arabic expert. And Maury is saying the Arabic root means not just to ask, but to challenge. So do you ever come across so if you go to some classes in synagogues, there are some people who hear what the teacher says and they ask a genuine, spontaneous question. And then there's some people in the audience, like the wise guys, who they use the teacher's initial teaching as a jumping off point or a springboard to kind of show how much they know and maybe challenge the teacher like he doesn't know. So I think what Maury and Rahmiel are saying is they're asking in a way that's a little bit aggressive. That's what Maury is saying. Rahmiel is saying it's a question that comes out of a contradiction. Not that you're seeking information, but you see an apparent contradiction. I think it's both of those actually. So he's kind of saying it doesn't make sense, but that allegation that it doesn't really make sense is kind of a challenge to Jewish tradition. Like you guys all make it out that we have to follow the mitzvot, and if you don't follow the mitzvot, bad things happen. I don't mean external, like you lose your money or an earthquake, but your soul is somehow devolves. And we're seeing here the first man violates the first mitzvah and he evolves. So something's wrong with the way you Hebrews are presenting your tradition. I think it's along those lines.
Let's see another question here from Loretta Levi. Is sechel the thing that separates man from animals?
No, yes, but the sechel that's a result of the Selem Elohim. Yes. So an animal cannot make a metaphor. An animal cannot create language. They have language, they have grunts. And so here's the big secret, and this is addressed in the Talmud, believe it or not, and also Aristotle recognized it. Human speech, unlike any other animal speech, has consonants. And consonants can be chained together to arbitrarily represent something. So I can chain together, let's say, the 3 Hebrew letters, lamed, het, mem, and lechem, and that can mean food or bread. An animal cannot do that. An animal can express hunger. Like I've heard geese that they have different honks. I'm from Seattle, so we go to Lake Washington. There's lots of geese, and we used to feed them. And I noticed they have 12 or 15 identifiably distinct honks. One is danger, one is let's fly, let's get the hell out of here. One is, would you give me some bread? One is, let's go in the water, all that kind of stuff. But they don't have consonantal speech. They can only grunt. They can only express emotion with a kind of noise. Humans have consonantal speech, so the cognitive function that allows you to create language and interpret language that's the kind of sechel that people have. Jacob Chereskin's question, we will get to next time. The Harambam is going to tell you exactly what the connotation of Yodai Tov Vara means and why Rabbin have that as opposed to a man with Selim Elohim. That's really the crux of this chapter. That's a great question, but that's the answer that Harambam is going to give us next time.
Okay. With that, thank you so much again, Rabbi Haleva. And thank you all so much for staying and joining us so late on the East Coast, for those of you joining on the East Coast, as well as the West Coast and around the country, through our new Sephardic Digital Academy initiative. If you're interested in learning more about all other classes and our programs, you can feel free to go to sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. Chacham, again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Buenas noches, everybody.
Buenas noches.
Bye-bye.